Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Claire Hanna, the SDLP MLA. We chatted to her all about Brexit, the Irish border issue, the breakdown at Stormont, and the DUP dark money scandal. If you enjoy the podcast, don't forget you can subscribe to us on Twitter, on Facebook, or you can subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. So let's get on with the show. So, Claire, thank you for agreeing to talk to me. You're the first MP, or not MP, MLA that I'll get to interview in our series. We're trying to get one from every single political party, but I feel that could be a challenge.
Okay. Well, if you give me an easy time, maybe they'll more readily sign up.
Well, yeah. I don't know if I gave... the other person we've interviewed was... right at the beginning was Kelly Armstrong, and I think she was expecting a nice lot of softball questions.
And you went all Paxman on it, did you?
Yeah, a little bit. She had a lot to say about TransLink, and I really don't like TransLink.
Okay. Probably less to say on that, but we'll think of something.
That's all right. Well, just to give us a good start, why don't you give us your thoughts on why Stormont is still not up and running?
Well, I suppose there's a few issues plumbing it all. Is Brexit, I suppose, which is just inserted issues around identity and the constitution and allegiance very firmly into the middle of politics, and the whole point of the Good Friday Agreement was to dial down those issues, and I suppose the two parties in the executive are obviously pulling in very different directions on Brexit, which is ironic because about 3 years ago they were both anti-Europe, but they're pulling in different directions, and I suppose with the different things they're trying to manage, they obviously thought that working through those internal tensions was going to be too much effort, and it's a disaster because even apart from the fact that there is no coherent voice for Northern Ireland, challenging though that would be, it's just the loss of the Assembly as a forum for trying to reach a consensus and reach agreement and to build up that trust and to get people out of the kind of stupid positions they might be in. They might do that in a committee situation when you're listening to 3 hours of evidence from an expert, but you're not going to do it on the Nolan programme. So I think Brexit is a big part of it, and I suppose particularly from Sinn Féin's perspective, they just didn't feel that it was rewarding enough for the effort that they were putting in. They felt, the kind of, boring business of government and governance. I think they got the very clear message in the previous two elections that kind of, campaigning and protesting were kind of more electorally lucrative, because when you're making decisions, inevitably you can't bring everybody with you. You have to. It's a little bit more difficult, but yeah, I suppose I think it's political opportunism, and it's also sort of 2 decades of rolled over problems that weren't really dealt with after the agreement that have all accrued, and the too hard pile just got really, really big.
To what extent do you think that this could be me being very cynical? Mm-hmm. Do you think that the loss of the petition of concern is a driving force behind the DUP's sort of unwillingness to be at the table? I'm not pointing the finger solely at the DUP, because
sure. I think there's something in that, certainly, that if you had in your back pocket the ability to stop anything you didn't like, that is, a comfort blanket if you're going into any sort of a government. And I suppose on the some of the key issues to them, they probably feel that they could still cobble together the 30 in terms of Jim Allister and maybe some others if they were genuine acute issues around post-conflict issues and potentially around equal marriage, but I don't think they will. I think I just get the sense that the UUP MLAs know that it's important not to on that. But yes, I think that's part of it. I think that's a big issue. The DUP have had all their own way for the last 10 years, and that's a frustration to me, because yes, the petition of concern and the kind of infrastructure gives them some of that, but they were led away with a lot of things. And for much of particularly the last 5 or 6 years in the executive, when those of us, the smaller parties, ourselves, Alliance and the Ulster Unionists, were kind of articulating a lot of the corruption and the dysfunction in governance. I think Sinn Féin probably felt, well, we can deal with this ourselves, and you've just got sour grapes and the infamous John O'Dowd "so what" comment about trying to kind of check some of this madness. And it does feel to me very clear that at that time the DUP had less than a third of the vote, considerably less than a third of the vote. If all of the parties who were opposed to the things they were doing had been working collaboratively against them, I don't think they would have been able to get away with some of the stuff they were at, particularly some of the dodgy stuff around RHI and Red Sky and so on. So I think part of the reason it got so bad because it was allowed to get so bad, and that's a frustration. But we're somehow framing it that our choices are awful government or no government, and I think that is sad, and that's making a lot of people cynical.
Naomi Long has been on TV more times than I can count, discussing the idea of getting the Assembly back up and running without an executive to vote on sort of small time matters and to legislate for, like, on an ad hoc basis, just for things that come up in the day-to-day running of a country that really the civil service can or shouldn't have to deal with. But is that realistic?
It's not, and I see where for the place from which the idea comes, and I believe in, representation and deliberation and kind of airing the issues, but it would literally be a talking shop in that it wouldn't have any mandate and it wouldn't be binding. And I like, in many respects, this idea of, well, just those of us, who are up for it and willing, going ahead to do it. But one, it wouldn't in any way have stability or as I say, democratic legitimacy, and it doesn't fit with the Good Friday Agreement in terms of ensuring, balanced representation and so on, and also the reality and the realpolitik of even when those parties had the the parties of the centre had the mandate, DUP and Sinn Féin were outside screaming in the windows. DUP screaming in the windows, I suppose, in terms of not actively participating, and then Sinn Féin, who in fairness were participating, but just over dragging out their responsibilities on things like decommissioning. Both of those parties kind of poisoned the well, even whenever they were peripheral. So when they're sitting with large mandates and as I say, in full-scale populist mode, even discussing the mundane things, it wouldn't be constructive, but quite simply it would be kind of a talking shop, and while there's there's always value in talking, it might delay even further the re-establishment of an actual forum for decision making.
What did you make of the Citizens' Assembly idea that was sort of floated in October, November of last year?
I believe in anything that can move discussion on, and I think if you look at the South and kind of that concept of genuinely deliberative decision making, when you kind of stare at facts for hours and hours and hours, rather than the sort of what we have at the moment, which is theories and assertions and kind of ideas. I think it's a really good idea as a supplement to representative democracy, which is something I believe very strongly in. But if it can advance some of the issues, and it can have a real look at some of the blockers from people who are free from the baggage of bringing people along with you, albeit nobody's probably free from the baggage of how they view issues here. So the Citizens' Assembly and civic forum and things like that. Those are things I'm in favour of. The more democracy, the better in a lot of respects. But again, it isn't a substitute, and it would be very easy for, in the same way as any politician can dismiss polls that don't, align to their views. It would be easy to dismiss on its own. But if you look at, for example, I think it was Queen's put one together around, and that very comprehensive polling that came out about 2 weeks ago, it was done with Queen's and I think the EU and UK think tank, that marked the shift even further to Remain in Northern Ireland, and it kind of looked at attitudes to Irish unity, attitudes to the stalemate, and it combined, I can't remember the exact methodology, but it combined some quantitative stuff around more traditional polling and then qualitative stuff around what was in effect a citizens' assembly that was selected to be representative.
Is that the one by Dr. John or Professor John Gary?
Yeah, and it gets really interesting results, and I think that type of thing, it informs the conversation, albeit it's not going to be a substitute for, I believe, representative democracy.
That's some very fair points. That particular study, actually, that you mentioned, had some pretty harrowing stats on how Catholics in Northern Ireland, and particularly Catholics who supported Sinn Féin, would view any sort of customs arrangement at the border whatsoever. I cannot for the life of me remember the MP who it was that brought it up in Parliament about 2 weeks ago. But just before this research came out, actually, they sort of quite sensibly pointed out that any cameras would become targets, and then they would become guarded cameras, and then they would become full-on border posts. Like any sort of fixture would become a target, and it would eventually escalate to the point you would have to have probably armed guards there or something.
Yeah.
And it really, really made me think about the DUP position being that they don't want any differentiation between Northern Ireland and the UK on our future trading relationship with Europe. Why do you think they're not willing to look at the special status?
Yeah, I mean, this is the DUP and other kind of Brexiters have basically three mutually incompatible aims here, that, the kind of constitutional integrity and lack of a border within the UK, and we're with them on that, and kind of no border on the island or between the two islands, but controlling our borders, our own trade deals, and everything to stay exactly the same. And it is nonsensical, and I think quite genuinely a lot of people just aren't engaging with the detail, because I suppose when were we ever asked as MLAs to go and negotiate a trade deal? We weren't. It's something that you have to have decided to inform yourself on, and sometimes people don't want to maybe get into the detail of things that challenge their kind of views on things. And I think project blame, that's just pin everything that's bad on Brexit on Brussels or Dublin or the Remainers or anything except the fact that it's a dreadful idea, I think is an easier kind of course to follow. But the thing is, and I think it's important to say, from our perspective, we've been very clear. We don't want a border across the island, but we don't want one down the Irish Sea. And I think it would be hypocritical and it is hypocritical of those parties who kind of imply that one of them is unbearable but the other one is okay. And while we conceived of the idea of special status, while an option that is no borders on either axis is on the table, and that is single market and customs union for the whole of both islands, I think we've got to go for that, and we go for that because special status would discombobulate political unionism. They've made that very clear, and I think we've got to hear them. But also, it would genuinely affect trade, on an east-west basis from businesses in the north and businesses in the south. And as I say, as a Europhile, as somebody who wants the European Union to work, I want the single market to be as large and coherent as it can be. So yes, the kind of special status is the lifeboat, and that's if we do seriously crash out and go wrong, then delighted we will be to have it, and there will be many advantages to it. But to me, I still think it's worth fighting for, and I think it still plausible to have a kind of a whole UK solution, because there are enough MPs who I think want it, but the problem is there are a lot of people who think something will come up, and this isn't like a normal negotiation where failure is the status quo, failure is catastrophe here. But I think a lot of people haven't got their head around this. They think that if the talks fail and everything fails, then we'll just have the status quo, and maybe we will in terms of transition forever. Yeah, what a nonsense. And again, it's kind of glib little phrases like that are fueling this whole insane episode of Brexit over 2 years, where just the quality of politics and democracy has become so eroded that people literally, like, I would occasionally, whether it's in a debate or an interview, I might accidentally stumble over a fact where I tell you, like, it's 52% but it's 51%, and that'll keep me awake at night, because like, oh my goodness, I'm misinforming people. But there are a lot of politicians who literally spoof, go out and repeat untruths that they know to be wrong time and time again, including some of this myth making around the border, that there would only be a border if the EU puts one. Lie. That we won't need a border because the goods are alignment isn't really a thing. Lie. People who must know, who aren't stupid, who must know that they're wrong, but it doesn't cost them a second thought to go out and spoof.
I do often wonder whether it's willful ignorance or just...
I think it's a combination of both.
Malice.
But I think at this point, most of the decision makers, I think it is. I mean, it's really complex. Like I've been immersed in Brexit for the last couple of years, and I still, if you kind of take a couple of days doing something else, it's hard to get back into it, because it's kind of moving simultaneously very quickly and very slowly. And as I say, it doesn't naturally come to you. Have no experience in negotiating trade deals and understanding the difference between single markets and customs unions and regulatory alignments and so on. But there are a lot of people whose job it is to understand, who can't pretend, it's not ignorance anymore. And it's important that we don't demonise voters, including voters in Britain, who, how could they have been expected? A lot of people here haven't got their head around some of the issues, and they are about trade and about the movement of stuff, but they are some of the more touchy-feely things as well, about identity and community and aspiration and all of those things. How can we expect voters in Britain to have picked up on those nuances? But the fact is, there's a lot of politicians whose full-time job it is to pick up on those nuances, and they have no excuse for not doing so.
Well, I guess it's really thrust the constitutional question of identity right back into the fore, and in a way that when I used to sort of talk about it in GCSE or A-level politics when I was at school, and it would just be like, well, it's not going to happen anytime soon. We're not going to have a border poll. It might happen in 20 years' time, but now all of a sudden there's Peter Robinson putting it forward as like a generational border poll idea, and I think it would have to be on a rolling basis anyway. Once it happens once, it has to be every 7 years.
No, there's actually a bit of a misunderstanding on that. It's as I read it, the legislation says once you've had one, there can't be another one within 7 years, rather than a kind of a rolling have to. Okay. And a lot of people say, and I know Jim Allister and I have debated this point where he interprets it as but I think it's pretty clear you can't have one in less than 7 years, but you don't have to keep having them, albeit once the ball is rolling, and the ball is rolling in a lot of respects. And I think, for those at the kind of very moderate end of nationalism who were prepared, who were kind of very comfortable in our Irishness, and I'm talking about myself here, but were prepared to spend, the next number of years and the next potentially number of decades, your political project was making Northern Ireland work. It was around reconciliation. It was around making the economy fit for purpose, with a view to integrating it with the economy in the south. But you were kind of putting it in that order. But the comfort blanket of being in the UK when it was more tolerant, it was outward looking, you had your shared European membership, it was broadly social democratic in its approach, you could live with it. But that comfort blanket was taken away by Brexit, and there was just a real two fingers to people of the identity that I have, that the principle of consent isn't just about the consent to be in the UK. I think to an extent it was the consent to what type of Northern Ireland we would be want to be in, but just this really dismissive majoritarianism that, Britain voted for it, so you're going and get over it, that has really really unnerve people. But I come back all the time to John Hume, as I do on most questions. It's not the territory that needs to be united, it's the people, and Brexit has done not one thing to unite people. So, all of those issues around reconciliation, and again, all of those issues around unifying, the infrastructure and the systems on the island hasn't been done. We haven't done the work, and the Brexiters were crass in their let's ask a massive question with a binary yes/no answer, and let's work out all the details afterwards. And I don't think Irish nationalism should follow them in that respect. Let's have a big divisive poll, and then we'll work out the details. I think we should always see the border poll as kind of one of the last pieces of the jigsaw. You've got the frames, you've developed the picture, and then the border poll is kind of asking people, well, look, here we have two economies that look a bit more like each other. Here we have sharing around health and education. Here we have harmonised, a lot of our social policy. Doesn't this make sense? Rather than kind of, where we're going, we don't need roads. Just give us your vote, and we'll work out the detail, which would really, which would create. I mean, if you look at the uncertainty, the one thing that I did agree with Peter Robinson, if you look at the kind of the dynamic that Brexit has inserted into politics, and multiply that by what factor when you're talking about a border poll. But I just think he totally misses the point. If you were asking about Peter Robinson there, rather than it's still failing to grasp that they should have been trying to present some version of a Northern Ireland in the UK that was comfortable to people that didn't share their identity, but instead he's just trying to move the goalposts on the mechanics, and it's just total failure of leadership.
I do kind of feel like they're missing a trick, and it's just like not a half-baked theory. It's something I've thought like a reasonable amount about, but in a way, if I were the DUP, I would be getting that Irish border poll out of the way faster than you could say Brexit. Because in my mind, the longer the Northern Irish project goes on, the more chance there is that we're eventually going to become part of a united Ireland. Whether that's in 10 years or whether that's in 50 is probably going to happen as the population changes, as if things continue to go the way that they look like they're going, that Britain becomes a bit more isolationist. They might even lose Scotland in a decade's time or less. And that I would be going to say, right, okay, look, we're going to have this border poll now, and then it's off the table for a while. And that at least gives them like the breathing room.
Well, I wouldn't really follow that logic, because it doesn't take it off the table, if you know what I mean. It only takes it off the table for maximum 7 years, which is the blink of an eye, really, in a lot of respects. And kind of, once it's there, it's there. People are working towards it. It just changes the dynamic. And I suppose, I think unionism probably does. It is that failure to have made a coherent case for the union, which is actually ironic, because there are things there's things that they could sell to people like me. They can sell the NHS, they can sell the BBC, they can sell a lot of the cultural stuff, but they keep trying to sell me the monarchy and the military and flags and stuff. I'm just not interested in. So, but I think there is just in a lot of unionism just a lack of imagination for the case that they would have to put. And so I wouldn't follow your logic from their perspective. It doesn't make any sense, because it's not putting it out of the way, if you know what I mean. But if they were serious, what they should have been doing is, as I say, trying to make it somewhere that people like me who are Irish, and I suppose this is the thing, I've never felt the need to get permission to be Irish off the DUP. I've never felt that their hardline views affect my identity.
You mean you didn't write them a letter at 15?
Well, this is the thing. I think there's a sort of a perception that we can't be Irish because the DUP are breathing down our necks. I don't know. I just have a different, and I suppose I was born in Galway. I'm married to a Dub. I have quite a cross-border enough existence, and maybe that just gives me a bit of confidence about it. But I wouldn't ever, I don't feel the need for the DUP to consent to my Irishness or my speaking Irish or anything like that. But I suppose they just lazily don't want to have to acknowledge that. I think it is a failure, particularly from the DUP's perspective, a failure just to understand that there are people who don't think the same way as they do on these issues of identity. And I suppose that speech that Arlene Foster gave a couple of weeks ago at an event, it was a really bonkers speech in a lot of ways, but it kind of finished with a couple of lines along the gist of which was, of course people will stay in the union, because why would you ever do anything else, because it's so innately part of who we are. And it was just that failure to understand, if your only pitch to the union is that people will have this instinctive innate loyalty, it's just a failure to grasp that isn't in everybody else. So people are entitled to be kind of transactional about it and kind of look at what's best for their family in terms of standards of living, but it's just this belief that enough people will feel it in their hearts, feel loyalty and will vote that way, and just a lack of pragmatism to accept that not everybody does feel that way, and you're going to have to make a more reasonable pitch.
They wouldn't even need to appeal to that many people with that argument, because given the way the population split, about 55-45 at this point.
Yeah, bear in mind, I think there's a danger in some of the demographic stuff, and polling would bear that out. But people are instinctively, I think, if you look at all the polling, a lot of people go, Irish unity is an aspiration that I have. It is that kind of really messy bit in the middle that I think, gives people fear. And the whole point was we were supposed to detoxify the issue of constitution and the issue of sovereignty change, and the Good Friday Agreement was supposed to provide the forum where we could each make our pitch to each other and just say, look, we have 95% of these issues in common, but here's how I think I can accommodate these differences in our identity, and those of us who believe in Irish unity persuading those who don't, and those who believe in the union persuading those of us who don't, if you know what I mean. But we didn't. We picked the wound for 20 years and we scratched and we poked, and we haven't really shifted that many minds. It's ironic that Brexit has moved so much more of the population than anything that nationalism, and I include myself in that, did over many years, because we weren't, we were letting demographics do the work, and now, if you look at the substantial vote to remain, it's completely disingenuous to peg those people as United Irelanders, but they are pragmatic people who were able to overcome kind of leaflets with Union Jacks on them and stuff, and kind of think about the logistics and the practicality. So just a lot going. A failure as always here to really get into the shoes of the other side, so to speak, and kind of understand what they want and try and reflect that in the offering you're making.
It's fair. Like as someone who voted Remain and would probably like to remain in the union within the UK, if Brexit goes horrendously, then I would be immediately forced to reconsider my thoughts on it.
Absolutely. I think that's completely rational. That and I think there are a lot of people in that category that you're in. Because I won't lie, I've always been just a big fan of the European Union in terms of the concept of transnational relationships and supranational decision making, and the fact that a lot of the things that affect our lives do not stop at borders, whether it's climate change or crime or trade or whatever, but just that concept. And I think Hume saw it again in the early 70s that it is a forum for shared endeavour. Your Irishness and your Britishness are less important than your you can fade them to the background, and by all means they're still a big part of you. The French and the German and the Austrians, they're no less French or German or Austrian, and they don't have these kind of crises of identity. But
the Austrians are it's a really weird
well
situation.
There's a thread there of a politics that I wouldn't be as keen on there, but it is exactly that. It's kind of the dynamic has changed around Irish unity. It isn't the way that, the misty, fiddly-dee, fourth green field crop that nationalism has been pushing for a lot of years. It is, that is the modern economy, that is your gateway to Europe, and that has dramatically changed the dynamic in any unity debate. But like I say, all of the challenges that existed on the 22nd of June 2016 around reconciliation, around allaying the fears of unionism, around the fact that we have two very different economies, one the fastest growing probably in Europe in the south, and one and very open, and ours that is very closed, very public sector dependent, and just sluggish. But none of those problems have been fixed by Brexit, and as I say, we haven't united people on it, so it hasn't really changed. It's changed the dynamics, but it hasn't changed the fundamentals.
What do you make of the DUP sort of dark money scandal?
I just think it's dodgy as heck, and I think that the dismissals, and I saw something, I think it was referring to this about. The dismissals. Yeah, we're better wrap up. The dismissals. I just think it was dodgy as heck, and I think some of the dismissals that how could we be expected to track all these donations? We're not talking about a tenner for a raffle ticket at a barbecue here. We're talking about serious money.
Jeffrey Donaldson says he knows who gave it to him.
Well, this is the thing. It's one thing, they know, and we've been told it's this whatever constitutional research group.
Oh, well, no, from what I inferred, from what I sort of got from the statements I've seen him make on it, he knows who was the original donor. Yeah,
I'm sure they do, and maybe there's a reason they don't want that to get into the public domain. But even if it was from a permissible source, it's such a distorting amount of money when you look at. If you look at the accounts of any of the parties in terms of the money that any of the parties turn over and that run their entire operation, this dwarfs it. And the fact that it was so clearly, and a lot of the stuff that's come out, it was so clearly being funneled through the DUP as a way to subvert the democratic process in Britain in terms of allowing additional coverage, buying that wraparound ad because everybody else had broke the bank in terms of their spending, and spending limits are there for a reason, so that we don't have money buys elections type scenario. So obviously distorting in both of those senses in terms of the amount of money that normally moves around politics here. And by the way, I think there's another political party that has an endless war chest on this island. And I do think it subverts democracy a little bit when there isn't equality of arms, when some parties have limitless resources in terms of staff time. And yes, you can go, well, that's capitalism or whatever, but I just don't think we want to get to the US style of politics where if you've got the dosh, you'll get the job sort of thing. But yeah, I just think it's distorting, and again, the DUP's failure to grasp why people are concerned about this is very typical of them and is worrying, and just that it's coming through in some of the testimony from the RHI inquiry, and it came through in their attitude to this, like, gosh, do you expect me to be across everything? £400,000 donation, tens of thousands of pounds in boilers. Jeez, I can't dot all the I's and cross the T's. It's just a real, for people who zoom in on the minor details around identity, to be so casual about issues of big money is worrying.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book about it.
Yeah. Oh, are you really? Okay. Yeah. Was there any other ones that you wanted just to get in quickly? I'm really sorry. There's just so much moving today. I'm going to have to
go some quick fire ones.
Sure.
You did international relations at university, if I'm right.
Yes, I did at the Open University. Yeah.
So, what did you make of Korea at the moment with the peace talks going on?
Yeah, I found the start of it pretty terrifying. I mean, how close you can be to nuclear meltdown because a couple of testosterone heads in North Korea and the US, are trying to jockey in that respect. It was, by the way, I worked in international development for about 10 years, and so those were more the focus for me around the European institutions and development when I studied, which was in my late 20s when I went back to the university, the Open University, because I took a year out after school, which turned into 10 because I had nothing to learn. I knew everything. I found that period of sort of almost will they won't they on nuclear war pretty alarming, actually.
South did a great bit on it. They just had their Trump character just like going. It didn't even seem like it was that far a stretch.
Yeah.
They had him tweeting like, "I can't believe Kim Jong-dong would insult me."
Yeah. I thought actually
it wasn't really that far from
when North and South Korea had the talks, and the Ulster Fry did a good bit. It's bad when North and South Korea's leaders are meeting more than Northern Ireland's leaders. The fact that if they could have a warm handshake.
That's good. Well, anyway, thank you very much.
No problem. Sorry, I have to rush off. It just ended up being a Brexity day. Quite often, you just you don't know when Brexit has a way of. I kind of did know that we did know these votes were coming, but something drops in and changes the dynamic, and you're.
Little 2 days of fun Parliament to watch, and then there's
exactly.
Aaron Banks and Dominic Cummings in front of
Aaron Banks, is he going? I thought he'd said no.
He said no, and then he said yes, and then they were like, "Well, you got to come. We're going to compel you." And then I think he's
enjoyed the show.
Okay.
Don't forget to follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, and you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, thanks for listening.